Welcome everyone to Constellations Conversations with Rowland Smith and myself, Nicola Dunn. So Robert, we decided today that we'd talk about constellations versus psychotherapy. So similarities, differences, what they are good at, where they overlap, and perhaps where they differ. So I think just to start, because I'm a little bit fresh from doing training with students, is I think they, if we were to take a popular subject like trauma, I think psychotherapy and constellations work best in different areas. So I would say, just as a first thought for us to kind of sort of chew on together, is that psychotherapy is best and has lots of skills at working on developmental trauma, whereas constellations look at intergenerational, transgenerational trauma. So they're more interested in that transgenerational cascade of trauma that is lapping down from different generations and pooling in a contemporary setting with the client, which is obviously quite different to the perspective that psychotherapy would take.
Yeah.
Bring what comes up for you.
Yeah, no, that's interesting to sort of tackle it through the lens of a theme like trauma. I was going to start by looking at it through the lens of methodology, but we can start with the theme for sure. That's interesting. So that's true, and it's one of the reasons why constellations is often referred to as systemic constellations, systemic family constellations. And it's systemic also even for an organization, because we're looking at what's happened in the past that might still be affecting the present. And I think that's a very helpful distinction. In psychotherapy, one would normally take the unit as the life of the individual, not the life of the system as a whole, going back almost infinitely, in fact, in constellations work. So that's very helpful. And I think as a build on that, probably in psychotherapy, we're often dealing more with, to use a technical term, intrapsychic phenomena, things going on within the patient's, client's head or psyche. Whereas in constellations, we're not only looking outside the psyche at other previous generations, we're obviously also trying to externalize what's going on, and in that to challenge the projections, the inner projections, the introjections, to use a psychoanalytic word, that the client might hold about their life too. So it's as if in psychotherapy, and you're a practicing psychotherapist, so I'm teaching you to suck eggs here, but it's as if in psychotherapy, the session takes place, as it were, within the dome of the client's psyche. And in constellations, it takes place within a kind of more global dome, I suppose, of the wider system. And that in the wider dome, the client is only one voice among many and doesn't have the authority over the narrative in a way that in psychotherapy they tend to, until the therapist challenges it.
Interesting. And just building on that, I think in psychotherapy, there is, depending on the orientation, which obviously it's a very wide church, psychotherapy, different ways of working with clients, but there is a sense that that the release of trauma bubbles where emotion has become trapped and compacted is very much an important part of that practice. And constellations, in a similar but different way, because often the events that are being looked at, as you say, involve other voices, other experiences. It's more like a chain of events rather than an individual experience of an event. So the kind of sensations we've both personally done both, so we can also talk as being the client. the sensations kind of happen within the sense of a wider expanse of who the client is and who they're connected to. Whereas in psychotherapy, it is that sense primarily that it's you, your caregivers, the people that you interact with currently, your kind of intimate relationships in which these issues show up.
Hmm. That's interesting. And back to your theme of trauma, about what kind of, as it were, works best in psychotherapy versus constellations. At the back of my mind, I've also been thinking as you're speaking, it's more common in psychotherapy, for example, for people to talk about, what's on their mind that week, and things like friendships, for example. Whereas I'd suggest a theme such as friendship comes up much less often in constellations, quite interestingly. And I think perhaps that's because people who've come to constellations get used to the idea that it is transgenerational. We're looking at things on a longer arc, perhaps, than sometimes in psychotherapy. And if we go one step further, actually, along the spectrum and talk about psychoanalysis, I mean, I don't know if you've been in psychoanalysis. I have. I was going to my analyst several times a week, paying an absolute fortune, of course, but partly because you go and see them so often, what you turn up with as you lie down on the couch is, oh, I just came out of this meeting and it was awful, and my boss is a terrible person. And it can, the material seems to be kind of fresher in psychoanalysis. And maybe psychotherapy is a bit closer to psychoanalysis in that sense, because you go to psychotherapy typically once a week. I mean, not sometimes more, but typically once a week. So the concerns that come up, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about this, can often be those things that have happened that week, which may lead to deeper, older questions and concerns, but the material tends to be kind of the news, whereas I think Constellations clients rarely present with the news.
Lovely way of putting it, Robert. I think the psychotherapy sessions, you have that regularity, you have a relationship over time, and clients come in with their, what I would call their contemporary hooks. What has happened recently where it is not kind of integrated or processed. There's a sense that something is sticking. And the process, in a sense, often starts from there and leads deeper, as we both know. And in constellations, it is interrelational, but in a different way. So psychotherapy, more contemporary relationships, a little bit into, as I said, primary caregivers, maybe siblings, etc. And in constellations, it's about larger arcs, vaster themes. It's more genetic, it's more almost karmic, if you choose to use those kind of words. So it is the legacy of the saga, the narrative of a bigger family, and the client is smaller in that context and map, and they are sort of under influences which are, or if we're working with systemic work, that are unconscious to them. So that the capacity for agency is slightly different, which is why constellations are really so valuable. They make the invisible visible. And in psychotherapy, you tend to start from the perceivable hooks.
That's fascinating. And it makes me think that maybe that's one way, again, if I reintroduce the notion of psychoanalysis versus psychotherapy for a second, one way in which constellations and psychoanalysis have something in common, more than perhaps constellations and psychotherapy, in that psychoanalysis, certainly in its origins and in its more rigorous form, is expressly designed to allow the unconscious to appear in the room in some way, and is often quite a quiet process. I mean, in psychotherapy, my experience of it, there will be silences occasionally, but generally speaking, it's a conversation. In psychoanalysis, the silences are longer, partly because the setup invites more silence. You're not facing your analyst, you're lying down. And that's expressly designed, that setup, to facilitate the emergence of material from the unconscious. And in a way, that's a bit similar to what goes on in a constellation. I mean, not that a constellation has to be particularly silent, but the frame, I suppose, of a constellation is one that is designed to skim off the kind of top layer of chatter and social interaction, so that what representatives speak in a constellation seems to come from a more, let's call it an unconscious place, or certainly a more primary place than you might sometimes get in psychotherapy, I would imagine.
Yes, that's making a few things clearer for me, Robert, that in a way, when we're talking about the unconscious material, we it's done in a particular way in a psychotherapy setting. But in a constellation, if it happens to be done in a workshop, we have representatives who take roles in this extended family, often, or themes or concepts of the client. So in a sense, they are representing elements of the client's unconscious. So the material that they bring down is unconscious. So normally, if you set up, the client's mother, she doesn't say what she might say if the client calls her, "You never call me." Instead, there might be a sense of, "I feel deeply lonely."
Mm.
So the representation is going immediately to a kind of deeper plumb line level. And so one's working with the underlying causes rather than, as you would say, the kind of top line dialogue.
Yeah, that's a great example too. "You never call me" is the outer symptom of the underlying sorrow or pain or suffering there. I'm deeply lonely. I really love that, what you said there. And I suppose it goes to an obvious point, maybe, that psychotherapy is called a talking therapy, and constellations is only somewhat a talking therapy. It's kind of hard to classify it. Well, it's hard to classify it anyway, but it's hard to classify it as a talking therapy. There's a bit of talking at the beginning, when we, in a previous video, spoke about the opening conversation or interview with the client. And that is somewhat psychotherapeutic, but with a sense that it's just the precursor to the constellation, really. Not just, but that's kind of its role. And that the talking done in that conversation and in the constellation itself by the representatives is a more, how should we put it? I mean, your example was beautiful. "I'm deeply lonely." I want to say it's almost, although more unconscious, it's almost more formal in a way. It's not chatter. It's not social. It's not that kind of "you never call me" complaining interaction, as it were.
I think you have your finger on the button here, that psychotherapy starts, it's a talking therapy. And I have a great respect for psychotherapy and all its different forms and people who work in it. And constellations, I think, are immersive, sensate kind of therapy. If we even call it therapy, I don't know if it is a therapy, but modality. And because one is immersing in a larger field experience, let's put it like that, because we have a number of people to hold that field experience. There's a field in the therapy room, which just happens to be 2 people holding. It's just slightly smaller. So it's with the immersive experience, I think it's very good for people who are more head orientated, if they're interested or brave enough to want to experience something, which is that movement from the head down into the heart and the body, can be very, very, very helpful for them. And if people who don't normally have feelings, if you stick with constellations over time, it's likely is one day you will catch a feeling scuttling past, because it is whatever the mechanism is between the mind and the body. When the mind goes perhaps a little bit into denial or disassociation or whatever, and puts all its recycling into the body, that mechanism is loosened. And particularly in the representatives, which is why it's so helpful. So you get to see, as we would say, your mother and father in a deeper light. You see the fullness of their life in a way that you wouldn't have seen it perhaps in another way.
Very rich, this discussion for me. And there are two things. One is the overlap actually between constellations and psychotherapy. And the other thing, which maybe we'll come on to in a minute, is the authority of the therapist versus that of the constellator, which I think, and they are a bit different, I think. So firstly, on the overlap between the two, you may help me to think really that in psychotherapy, and certainly I do a lot of coaching. Although if you were to, walk past, as I'm giving a coaching session, I'm not sure you'd see there's any difference between that and psychotherapy, to be honest. But anyway, I will often ask my coaching clients to do some sort of visualization or mentalization based on constellations, where they will summon up people in their family system, a parent or something else. And, that's a kind of specific technique. But I would imagine not only in psychotherapy could you do that anyway, if you wished, particularly if you're like you, constellator. But in any case, once you have the, mum and dad, for example, present in the room, in the psychotherapy room, once they're there as images in the room, they can actually be spoken of by the therapist, you in this case, in a more constellations-y way or systemic way anyway. So rather than, your fantastic example, rather than the why do you think she doesn't call you conversation, your intervention might be, so what I hear is that she's deeply lonely. So you might already be working in a kind of more constellations-y way. So there are overlaps there. So once the people spoken of, like mum and dad, aren't represented necessarily, but they are manifested in some way, or they're brought into the room, aren't they, at least as images?
Yes, exactly. So they are, I think it's the difference between representation and giving them space in the therapy room. And, I do coaching too, and I would see what you do is kind of deep coaching. So I guess I'm curious, we speak about the overlap. I'm also curious about the underlap. And that constellation processes tend to have larger spaces between them. So that the sort of frame is, the therapeutic alliance and frame is a little different. There may be an arc over time, but the frequency and the contact is slightly different. So that it's not so much about smaller amounts in a regular sequence, it's deeper experiences, and then once they're integrated, then another deep experience. So they can kind of leap over a little bit of a period of time and then come back in. And also often, I think, just because sometimes I would see people for a one-to-one maybe after a constellation, it's a little bit, you have the possibility of seeing to what degree has their mind started to meddle with it a little, and to what degree are they remaining focused on the final image, as opposed to a quirky moment in the middle.
Mm.
So I think that's maybe something that is different between the two.
It is. And I mean, constellators, to change the tone altogether, also have a bit of a problem making money sometimes, because they run an amazing process, it has this huge impact, and then they don't see the client again for another few months, or they're not coming back and paying again for a constellation for another few months. Nevertheless, you know, there is that need sometimes for what you call integration. So this is a bit of a gray area, I think, in the, I don't know if it's an overlap or an underlap, maybe a bit of both between constellations and psychotherapy, whether the constellation is a kind of, you know, one-off stadium gig, and then you don't go back and see the band again until it tours in a year or two, or actually whether you go and come back and see the constellator for that integration, whether or not they're a psychotherapist, over a period of, I don't know, several weeks, several months even, in order to do that work of integration and keep the issue holder in the space of the resolving images, rather than, you know, as you say, some sort of kink in the process along the way. So there's, you know, there's a kind of commercial aspect to that, as well as a kind of clinical or professional aspect to that as well, because the constellation does tend to be a kind of one-off, really, for a lot of people.
Yes, I mean, I think Bert would, Hallinger, obviously, he had a, you know, a kind of global presence, and he was, you know, traveling around the world, which you do get in with, you know, significant constellators. You know, there are slightly closer to a rock star sometimes than what you might think of as a traditional psychotherapist. So there is a sense of being able to do these big, more stadium events. But as you say, in a way, you are starting a relationship with someone who comes to your constellation, a therapeutic relationship. And so I guess that model is changing, and it is possible, if both don't meddle in the constellation piece, but actually work therapeutically with it, and perhaps work with how the client is going to integrate it into their life. You know, what are you going to do with this? And how is this going to make a difference?
Mm.
Because in a sense, the client's energy system has changed, and it's, you know, it's now how does that show up in your life, and how do you show up in your life with this knowledge which you can't now unsee?
Mm.
That your mother is just not, you know, I'm talking about mothers, and I am a mother, so, you know, you're not just seeing your mother as someone who's always wanting more from you, but you're maybe somehow able to be a little present to her loneliness.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I wonder if the model, you say it's changing, maybe it will change more. Maybe there will be more of a sense of constellations being more part of an ongoing process for people. It's not really perceived as that very much these days. It's more perceived as a, you know, come along for this amazing experience, and then we may or may not see you again afterwards. Can I just come back to this theme of authority? Because I mean, you and I trained together, and I remember in our training this point being made, that there is a different level of, or different kind of authority in the room for the constellator and the psychotherapist. Be interested in your take on this. Partly because the constellator has this extraordinary resource behind them, you know, the field, the constellation, and of course you've got to learn how to drive. It's like, you know, if you're given keys to the Porsche, you've got to make sure you can drive a fast car, you know. So you do have, you know, I think the constellator, you know, once you've learned how to drive the Porsche, knows they've got that incredible power behind them ready to deploy in a way which certainly is a coach and perhaps as a psychotherapist, you don't have that thing revving in the background. You've just got the conversation. So I think, firstly, because of that, there is a power, I think, that constellators have in principle that maybe psychotherapists don't have. But also, I think because the exchanges between a constellator and a client versus a therapist and a client are a bit more asymmetric, I think. Yes, the therapist and the client are in different roles, but there's a sense of kind of equality. Like, I'm the professional here, you're the client here, but we're sort of on a human level it's a kind of human practice. And although Constellations is also obviously a human practice, there's something about there's a kind of severity, I think, also sometimes in Constellations, because it is kind of refusing to indulge some of the narratives that people bring into a therapeutic conversation. It doesn't tolerate those endless interjections that one might get and projections that one might get. It can also simply set the client aside while the constellation runs. And while the constellation's running, although the constellator is, infinitely subject to the field, at the same time, they're the one kind of making the decisions around that, who to bring in, who not to bring in, stand up, sit down, who to ask, who not to ask. And all of that leaves the client sort of sitting there as this spectator, really, in their own life. And they don't actually have much agency at that point. And that's deliberate. We don't want them to have agency because we don't want them to screw things up again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. I think you're just highlighting this kind of wonderful difference in the sense that, we all live out our material in our lives, don't we? So all our relationships, they have similar patterns, like here we go again, because they're bringing up these things for integration. And what you're saying is that, I believe in a constellation where it's also time limited, we don't have time to indulge. You show us how you normally do this, and it's a joining with the client in order to expand their view of possibility. And really, you're taking their thinking about something, about an event or an issue they had. You may be sort of rolling it in the dust, flipping it over, all sorts of things. So in the end, what is left there as an image is a completely different view on something which they may have struggled with for a very long time. So you've taken all the colors, swirled them, mixed them, put them in different corners, and that's its magic in a way. Magic is that nothing is as it seems. And that's one thing you probably guarantee in a constellations process. Brilliant.
That's fantastic. Glad we're recording these, because that was terrific. We should excerpt that and put it online. Nicola, we should finish in a minute. I'm just looking at the timer here, and maybe a way of finishing this is to talk about time, because a constellation is not a fixed period of time. A psychotherapy session is. And although a psychotherapy client might be well aware of the next client, creaking in the hallway outside, or the door opening, or the, taxi pulling up, I think they're probably a little less aware than they are in a constellation, because in a constellation, you're sitting in a group, and the next person to go, unless, you're there at the end of the day, I suppose, is kind of there, and, everybody's always polite. But, you're also conscious that there has to be a time limit on this, even though it's not a fixed one. So there's an interesting sense there, maybe for the client as well, maybe in some anxiety for the client, how long a constellation am I going to get? Am I going to get my money's worth? Am I going to, what if the constellator says this is all nonsense, sit down? Or what if the constellation is just very brief because, sometimes they are. I mean, my record constellation is probably about a minute, you know, but you know, equally I'm sure I've done ones that lasted an hour, possibly longer.
That's really interesting. I'm just thinking of the sort of therapy room with the therapist and the client, and then suddenly the walls flip down and they're on a larger stage. You know, the clients of that day, who may be 5 or 6, are all sitting in a circle. And they are, I guess, but they're learning from each other. That's another point, isn't it?
Mm.
Those that work on that day, there is a natural order, as an unconscious and natural and therapeutic order as to who goes first and who goes in the middle and who goes last. There's often emerging similar themes. So even if they've never met each other before, somehow they have collected on this day. And as you say, there is a sense of, it's more like a you know, when you crack a raw egg in a pan, that's the shape and the length of time of the constellation. It's not a little cube of sugar where you could measure it immediately. It's kind of roughly that size and shape and that length.
Mm. But it's still an egg. Very good. Very good. Nicola, we should draw this to a close. I mean, it's interesting, in our own sessions here, we've got slightly longer and longer every time we talk. So we started at, I think, about 23 minutes. The timer here is now up to 31, and you know, it's gradually expanding with the time, but I think we probably should bring things to a conclusion there. So thank you very much. Good to talk to you as always. Let me just remind people who are viewing to please like the video, and please also subscribe, because that gives us some encouragement. And please do follow up with Nicola or me. You can contact Nicola. She has a website, nicoladunnconstellations.com, or mine is my name, robertrowlandsmith.com. And look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you. Bye, Robert.